Imagine, if you will, my family didn't even want to come to this land, taken as hostages from the motherland, West Africa, taken to foreign land, those who were unlucky enough to survive the Middle Passage, ended up working as slaves for those men and women who owned them. Working, pulling. Some of them were brave enough to try to find their way to the promised land, old Canada. They traveled the Underground Railroad, making their way north, seeking the promises of the promised land. Some of them found their way to Nova Scotia. Those who fought for the British, the Loyalists, promised land in Nova Scotia. But when they got there, they found that the land that they were promised really wasn't there at all. Pushed and tucked away on the margins of cities and towns where the white settlers were. And one of the most beautiful of those settlements was Africville, on the beautiful shores of Bedford Basin, home to many of the Black loyalists who had survived that Middle Passage, had found their way to the Promised Land, had made their home in Africa, on the outskirts of Halifax. But also, that was home to the city dump. It was home to the city prison, home to the undesirables. And then, imagine if you will, it's the 1960s, and Halifax is under development, and they coveted the beautiful shores of Bedford Basin. But there was a little problem. There were Black residents living there. They convinced the Black leaders of Nova Scotia of the day that really the people in Africa were undesirables. The homes that were there were really not worth fixing up. And they convinced them that they would have a much, much better life if they were to integrate into the city proper. Those that had beautiful homes in Africa were able to go and buy property. They were given about $5,000, and they were able to buy property in other parts of the city. And they did, dispersed. No longer a community of Africa. Those that were living in the very uninhabitable shacks were given $500. They were put in public housing in Uniacke Square and Mulgrave Park. And they were moved to those public housing projects on the back of city garbage trucks. And the last man who refused, Paul Carter, the last resident of Africa who absolutely refused to leave, they tried to entice him with $5,000 in cash in a briefcase. And he still refused to move. But they eventually moved him. And one of the worst things that they did was they bulldozed the church in the middle of the night. Because the wisdom of the leaders involved thought they knew, that if there was no church, there would be no Africville, that the people would find what they need. Imagine now, fast forward to 2010, and we have the legendary apology from Mayor Peter Kelly. I would say that it was a heartfelt apology. I would say that he was very genuine in his apology. I would say that many of the residents of Halifax and probably the rest of Canada felt good about the apology and some restitution that was paid. But let me tell you, imagine that you're one of the descendants of Africville who's still living on the margins. Imagine you're one of the descendants of Africville who's still disenfranchised. Imagine if you're one of those 3 or 4 generations from Africville still living in public housing. Then you imagine if an apology is enough for you. And I would imagine you to think that for many it's not. That apology, that collective compensation to the community at large does nothing to deal with the multi-generational pain and trauma that I would say goes beyond the destruction of Africville and reaches back to the day that we were stolen from the motherland.